Welcome to Beyond the X, a podcast for ambitious marketers navigating transformation, both of their organizations and of themselves. Today, I'm joined by Kyle Shank, and Kyle is incredible. He's a marketing and analytics leader who has spent his career inside large, complex organizations, whether technology behemoths like Meta or legacy institutional brands like Hershey's. And he's worked at the intersection of data, decision-making, and change. But what makes Kyle incredible is not only his openness, but the fact that he often operates at the center of a problem that most leaders recognize, but few know how to actually solve, which is how do you drive meaningful change inside a system that you do not fully control, where incentives can be misaligned, resistance is often present, although it can be invisible, and most transformation efforts don't actually succeed. So in this conversation, we unpack what it really takes to lead change from the inside. And let's be clear, it is far less about the technology or the process that most people think. Kyle shares a deeply open and deeply candid view of what makes transformation possible and what causes it to break. From how to tell if the mandate is actually real or just performative, how to create early momentum to get people on board, how to confront resistance, and how to survive that messy middle of any change transformation project where energy starts to fail and doubt really starts to creep in. But we also spent time on something that I don't think we talk about openly enough, which is how do you recognize when that transformation simply isn't going to work? And what does it actually take to walk away? So if you've ever looked inside your organization and thought, something here needs to change, but I don't know where to start, I don't know if I'm the right person to do it, and I don't know if I'm set up for success, I hope this episode starts to change how you think about influence, how you think about incentives, and how you think about what's really required to go on a change transformation journey inside a large, complex organization. Let's dive in. So I want to start with a hard truth, which is that most transformations inevitably fail. And I think when you look at marketing leaders today, a lot of them are sitting there saying something in my org needs to change. Yeah. But oftentimes they don't fully control the budget. They don't fully control the tech stack. They don't fully control the culture. And so what I want to talk about is this very messy process of change management. And how do you navigate it all the way through? Everything from how do you decide whether to accept a change management mission, right? Are you set up for succeed? How do you create momentum? How do you fight resistance? How do you win during the messy middle bit of endurance? And ultimately, how do you know if or when you should walk away? And so you have been through some change management journeys. I think you probably understand better than most that, a lot of it lies in the soft stuff, right? The beliefs, the energy creation, all of that. So before we get into a lot of philosophical conversation, I want to ground this in a change that you've navigated because I'll keep asking you to refer to it all the way through. So tell us about a major change and transformation project you underwent. Give us the highlights, make us feel like we were there. Yeah. And then let's see what you learned from the process.
Happy to. So, hi, I'm Kyle. In a previous role, I helped to shepherd in a bunch of changes to basically a marketing organization. And in sort of legacy CPG world, marketing tends to move fairly slowly in a fairly scheduled way. And so marketing measurement always lags, marketing operations, right? So whatever you have set up in the marketing ops side of your house, your measurement team is going to reflect that to a certain extent. And one of the problems you have is in this legacy CPG world, right? People want to know information to make optimizations faster than they actually can make optimizations to what they do, right? If you are a large legacy TV buyer, there's not that much you can change day to day. But the zeitgeist of like executive leadership and how people view marketing now, especially after, basically now 20 plus years of performance marketing being the paradigm that, people like to think through, everybody wants to optimize, but they can't. What are you optimizing, right? Are you going to shift your budget from HGTV over to QVC or something silly? Like, no, you're not going to do any of that. But we wanted to figure out ways to make the standard of measurement in this sort of legacy CPG space more rigorous, faster, more impactful, not just getting like ROI reads for a given channel. And so we explored a lot of different ways of a lot of different analytical approaches. And the biggest one we focused on was basically, can we more effectively measure creative, right? Because most marketing teams, especially most media teams, are hyper fixated on audience as an audience first perspective, right? Who is my addressable audience? Does my addressable audience match my strategic audience? Can I tactically reach these people? How can I better specify them? Should I use some kind of audience model that looks at like retained versus engaged or something like that, right? But the reality is, if you're a company that sells like a relatively low price point product all the time, right? Imagine if you're a large chocolate company, right? Like where I may have worked. Like if you sell a low price point chocolate bar to everybody with a functioning throat, maybe you don't need to hyper focus on more and more audience work or buying more segments or building more segments. And especially your analytics team, that might just be a waste of energy, right? The ultimate ROI on it, measuring resource inputs, labor costs, data acquisition for a $3 product might be kind of upside down. And so we pivoted to focusing much more on like, what are we actually saying to people? And can we use analytical tools to talk about it?
Yeah.
Right? Can we understand which messaging works better than others? And not just in some like A/B test fashion, but really like diagnose the things about different creative choices we might make across a different suite of brands that are more impactful at driving, people to buy, a product one more time in a given year, or buy more of them for whatever reason. Can we start up entire new use cases based on marketing messages, right? What kind of marketing messages might breed new consumer opportunities? And that was a big change, right? Because a lot of the organizational inertia isn't about diagnosing creative. And, I love creatives, and the last thing creatives really ever want is a nerd rolling in to like try to work with them.
You're not very popular there, are you?
Well, I was.
We'll get to that. Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Let me separate, because you've said a lot of things that I think merit digging into. So, all right, so you have this opportunity on your hands, and it is to transform the way measurement works at an established legacy CPG brand that makes a mass consumer good.
Yep.
When you decide whether to accept this mission, right, and to go on this journey, what do you look for to determine if the intent to change is real or performative?
Oh gosh, I'm going to use like the worst MBA analogy here.
Love
this is
it.
Great.
Keep them coming.
You have to understand if they want a thermostat or a thermometer.
Okay.
Have you heard this?
I have not.
I feel like I've
Educate me.
absorbed this.
Give me the framework.
From like LinkedIn probably. And like this is like the most
no.
embarrassing admission. I don't know where this came from. This is not an original thought, but I'm going to pretend that it is for our purposes. Most people who are brought in to do transformation jobs are not completely unknown to an organization. Right? They're either someone who's been in the industry for a while, they have some kind of executive connection, or they have been shamelessly pimped out by a consultancy, something like that. They're usually not unknowns. They can't be an unknown, because if they're being brought in to change something about a company, they probably need to know something about that company, or at minimum that industry.
Yes.
Like otherwise it's just like a silly action. So they're usually not an unknown. But what you need to know is, are you being brought in for actual work or for performative work? And that's the thermostat versus thermometer question, right? Am I coming in there to just take the temperature, or am I coming in there to change the temperature? And that is really something that you need to get answered before you even consider taking the job.
How do you answer that question?
You need to ask about incentive alignments, right? Are the incentives inside of the organization that you're being asked to change aligned to change, right? Many times you can have an incentive structure organizationally that will reward people for not participating in a transformation process, right? Imagine if there is no tolerance for change, right? Like if you're being brought in to, let's just pick an example. Imagine you're being brought in to do like transformation to a supply chain. And so of course you have some kind of like fault tolerance, right? You can't disrupt the manufacturing process. You don't want to do X, Y, and Z, et cetera. But if everybody is gold on their contribution to the supply chain being held on time and fixed, and anything you need to do to transform it will misalign with an individual's incentives, you are now encountering a structural roadblock, or at best, a very strong set of structural friction. And so understanding the layout of who is incentivized to participate in change and who is not is like very, very important.
Well, let's make this specific to you.
Yeah.
You were presented with this mission. You were not unknown to the company where you decided to go and
Yep.
undergo this measurement change transformation with creative being at the heart of it. You accepted the mission.
Yep.
What did you look for that told you the desire to change was real? Or actually, are there things you would look for now that you didn't at the time?
Colloquially, I'll say, I knew I had permission to be a chaos Muppet.
Who did that permission come from?
Well, and so this is where it comes. So when I came in, I knew two important things. I knew I was being hired explicitly to change how things ran. And I knew that the person who hired me had the mandate to do so. And so that's why I think so many like chief transformation officers are brought in by CEOs, because you do functionally need the mandate of heaven, right, to get stuff done often. And especially if people throw up blocks or if you run into just large, immovable institutional issues, you need to be able to leverage the person who has the mandate. And so I think, to get back to the original question, right, the first thing you really need to do, besides understanding if you're truly being hired to do transformation or not, that sort of ties into is the person or function hiring you, do they have a mandate to actually drive change? So like in my position at the Hershey Company, right, I was brought in by the head of media. The head of media has remit over all of how media works. So I knew that the person bringing me in had the mandate to drive change. So I had that institutional backing to go in and get all the things done that needed to be done.
Excellent. So you validate that the CEO is in fact serious about the change, and you have that mandate to be a chaos Muppet, in your words.
Right.
Not words I use to describe you,
Well,
but
there's
nonetheless.
chaos Muppets and there's order Muppets, but this is a separate philosophical discussion. Yeah.
And it sounds like you validate that the people around you who would have a disproportionate role to play in that change being successful are also on board and correctly incentivized.
Right.
Okay. So you accept this mission, right?
Yep.
You're like, okay, this is not a trap.
Yeah. I'm
going to go in and do the thing.
This isn't like a 2-year rundown to a vesting date.
That's
There's an actual job to do here.
Fantastic. So you accept the mission, you get inside the organization, and let's be real, very few people like change. Psychologically, change is very uncomfortable. So I think about the first couple months being brought in with this transformation or change management remit as being really critical. So how do you create momentum, that initial momentum to bring people along? And here I'm especially curious, in your experience, what were some small wins that you think had disproportionate impact in terms of trying to create some of that momentum?
I'm going to preempt that question with an overarching answer, which is, if you're entering into this kind of role, you need to make sure that you have the emotional strength to deal with all of the negative emotions that may come from your job, right? Like you're going to expend political capital. Like transformation in general is really just the expenditure of capital. In some cases, it's legitimate capital, right? Like you need to go and change process, requires money, or it's political capital of you're going to be, crediting and taking debits from the political capital of all the people around you to achieve your goal, specifically the person who hires you, right? That's what that mandate's important for. But it can be tough. It can be exhausting. It can be draining, especially if you run into, like you just said, like things, people, processes, whatever that don't want to change. It is an emotionally taxing kind of work. And so I think a lot of people discount that. Like transformational work is not sterile, right? And so you need to have a wealth of like emotional grounding to effectively do it, because it's not a sprint.
Yes. We're going to come back to this because my sense is that becomes especially critical during sort of the messy middle of the transformation. But when you're in there, you get in there, the slate is clean, the energy, the battery is fully charged, you're ready to go. So where are some of the first few places where you dispense that energy?
Yeah. So you have to do your birth and your bans. So you have to give birth to a few things and you have to ban a few things, and you have to do them fast. You need to let people know that failure is tolerable and things will break. And you need to set that precondition, because this gets back to the incentive discussion, right? Part of transformation is you're theoretically either breaking something that's not working or bringing something in to replace something, right? Or augmenting something has to be shifted, which means someone is going to view that change as a failure, right? Most people in a work environment are risk averse for a variety of reasons. And so you're asking people to go against their own self-interest often. And so you need to set basically a behavioral cue and a language cue, right? You need to tell people that it is okay for things to change, and that may cause failures, that may cause frictions, whatever. And then you need to model it and give people transparency into what's changing, and try to get as many small wins as possible, right? A brilliant case study of this exact thing is the current New York mayor, right? If you look at all of the things that are coming out of the press office about what the new New York City Mayor Mamdani is doing, they're just little small wins, but they're accumulating very quickly.
Yes.
And so that gives people, both constituents in this particular example, but like back in the business world, this would be coworkers, colleagues, whatever. If you show those small wins coming in consistently versus waiting for some large win, that lets people know that progress is actually happening, which creates a greater degree of air cover for all of those other changes you have to do, and the way you use language to set the tone, and the way so it's a great thing to just get a couple things out of the way quick.
Yes.
Right. So you need to basically birth the cultural environment to allow things to happen, and incentivize getting a few small wins done quickly, just to show people that you have inertia.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to squash a couple of very, very important things, which is shadow vetoes. So people who can veto change who are not in the org chart explicitly, that is usually a problem you'll run into. And so in highly matrixed organizations, right, there's always somebody who can veto change who may not be apparent in the org chart to some outside entity. And so you have to figure out who those people are and quickly work with them to get them on board. So you really have to squash this idea of like the shadow veto. And at the same time, performative actions gotta go. Do not start up some lab, right? Don't start up a transformation lab, right? Don't do some giant pilot, because that's just performative change, right? That's all you're doing. You're making a spectacle versus making progress.
Yes.
And so the time that you invest in creating that is probably better spent in those first 3 months actually getting a small win done.
Yes.
Just in just the opportunity cost trade-off of who is that deck for? If you're building a transformation strategy deck, that's really just for the person who hired you. And if they need that to feel justified in your capabilities of transformation, you're already off on the wrong foot because you don't have their mandate. Yeah. So that's why I'm like this idea of performative but not practically useful activities, as well as this idea of like the shadowy folks in an org chart who will disrupt transformation, if not sort of captured or convinced or something like that. Those are the things I tend to think the most about.
So it sounds like what you're saying is in those early days when you're creating momentum, you need the small wins. I like the birth and bands framework. But part of that to me as you're talking seems to be about making people believe that this change is possible and this mission is achievable, right?
Right.
So when you think about, again, going into this company, accepting the mission, knowing you're there to improve the standard of measurement, especially as it concerns creative, what were the first small wins you engineered that you felt were disproportionately important at creating that belief system?
I think a good example is thinking about how creative interacts with ROI, right? So in the broadest sense, right, like ROI is pretty straightforward, right? Revenue over costs. But if you break it down, it's effectiveness over costs, right? Mm-hmm. So just putting it like, build out your fraction for a second. So the return from a marketing dollar is like, let's just say how many dollars of sales per 1,000 impressions you run out there, and your costs are just the cost to run 1,000 impressions, right? And so whenever we talk about creative, people usually talk about it through the lens of effectiveness, right? If my creative is better, it's going to sell more stuff, which is standard. Like that's normal. That's an intuitive way to think about creative. We never think about creative's impact on costs. Now, there's a variety of reasons. Like one is like most old CPG companies, right, use an MMM model, and nobody brings in operating costs in their MMM. They just bring like cost to serve. They don't do any of that stuff. It's usually just like working media dollars out the door. We don't count agencies. We don't count production budgets, whatever. So that's like one reason why they think that way. But the other is that most people who work in a measurement space have often not worked on the actual tech side or the media delivery space. And so they often, and especially on the marketing side, they often don't have a lot of clarity into the different factors and signals that go into like ads delivery on your YouTubes or your Metas or your Snapchats or whatever. And so one of the first things we did was this analytical exercise to say, hey, is there a relationship between some measure of our creative effectiveness or like quality, right, to deliveries that are like how well are they following guidelines for the practices or the best practices of each platform? Is there a relationship statistically between that and actual cost to serve? And unsurprisingly, like there is, right? And it basically says, the more adherent your creative is to the best practices of a given platform, the cheaper that creative is to deliver on that platform. And there's a pretty good reason for this, right? Like a lot of major media platforms where folks are spending a lot of their digital dollars have an incentive to want to keep their users on the platform, right? Like you get paid if you're YouTube or if you're TikTok, the more folks are on there scrolling, the more ads you can serve them, the more money you can make as a company. So they want to keep you around. So the way their ads auctions work probably is the better the ads are, which then they'll tell you what a good ad looks like, right? They'll say, follow this format, use these rules, here's the safety zones, don't violate them. The more you follow that, the less or the least likely you are to give a disruptive ads experience. And the fewer disruptive ads experiences there are, probably the longer people will stay around. So there's this flywheel between if your ads, from a creative perspective, adhere to these different standards at a higher rate, they probably tend to be cheaper because they drive fewer negative consequences for the places in which they're being served. And so proving that out sounds kind of like dumb, right? Like, oh, cool, better creative is cheaper. Thank you for the insight, smart, potentially overpaid analytics man. But what that allows you to do later is flip the conversation about what the impact of creative is on its head. So historically, a lot of, and shout out to any creative agency person who might be listening here, because I'm about to just hype you up real big. So most creatives, either internally to a big organization or externally, the agency side, whatever, we live and die kind of on vibes, right? Like, did they like the work? Did we think the work did well? The measurement of creative effectiveness is so tenuous that like it's never really stuck super well. And so there's always this just inherent anxiety about, is your creative performing well or not? That's true internally as well. This lets me say, hey, maybe we don't have to have that conversation, which is always difficult and really comes down to like, did the CEO like the ad? Did the CMO think that you knocked it out of the park with this particular campaign, whatever? Now we can say, hey, the actual production of our assets, if they follow X, Y, and Z rule, can save us 6, 7, 8 figures a year in costs. That gets creative into an entirely different conversation because most creative budgets are slashed, right? Creative budgets are where you go and find money when, the marketing org has to give money back to the company. And so they're always under pressure. But if we can say, hey, actually, the expansion of this budget, let me make more adherent creatives. Let me get better, more diverse communication styles out into the market, because that will not only probably drive more effective outcomes, it will lower the cost to serve our ads, which is something the media organization will really care about, because when our CPMs go down even a little bit more, even just a little bit, you can expand your impact. You can have a higher ROI because that's the really important movable part of the fraction. Effectiveness is this black box that we all stare at and try to figure out all the time and has all these moving parts. But the bottom part is just cost to serve. Yeah. And so bringing creative out of that mushy numerator down into an impactful lever in the denominator was sort of my initial goal. Like that was the first thing we could do, because that gives me at the time, a very useful like data point of, hey, more adherent creative makes our cost cheaper. Awesome. The knock-on institutional things you can change with that fact being agreed upon lets you bring creative into a very different version of performance conversations. It lets me talk about the funding of creative very differently, because now we have a really good reason to maintain or expand funding to make sure that these different creative production teams internally and externally can build the right creative for us. And that was the whole goal. Because part of the change was, let's just stop focusing on measuring spots and dots and let's start getting a little bit deeper. And it starts with just a simple insight that you tactically expand into an attempt to change the way the organization and cross-functional teams think about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so letting creatives talk about like, ooh, I make stuff cheaper is silly on its face, but allows for a significantly richer conversation and amount of institutional wiggle room for change.
It's not silly at all. It shows the evolution of a belief system, right? And I think there are a number of things you said that are really important, but it sounds like one is you engineer that first win to be grounded in some sort of data.
Yeah.
And then to be the first domino to fall as part of an evolution of a larger story. So what I liked about what you said is there was always intention for a bigger view and philosophy you wanted to bring to the organization, but you needed them to believe and accept one thing first in order for them to feel comfortable going on the rest of the journey. 100%. So you almost work backwards from there to create that win. Now, okay, so you've created that win, you've demonstrated creative can have a meaningful and statistically valid impact on cost to serve. And this is where I typically find you get your first win, you're excited, maybe you even get a boost of energy to your energy tank. But this is also when I find that we tend to enter phase 3, which is the resistance starts to come out and start to become more vocal. Now, you've talked a little bit about the kinds of things you got to ban right away, right? Shadow vetoes, performative actions make sense. I'm curious about what kind of resistance do you initially allow because of the perception that, or do you allow any kind of resistance in order to give people time to come along for the journey? Because again, change is hard.
Yeah.
And we don't like change as people.
You have to give people space to participate in the narrative, right? Boy, what a millennial sentence that was, right? So what I mean by that, right, is everybody thinks correctly that they are the good guy in a story, right? Like we're brains in meat suits walking around all day. We are our own stories. We're participating in them and we're acting them out. And so the hardest part about changing anything is that you need to give people a reason to want to. So you said this earlier, like you need to give them a reason to believe. And belief is not a coordinated event, right? People have a variety of reasons as to why they may lag or lead their comfort or buy-in with change. So I think trying to strong arm people's comfort with change to a schedule is almost doomed to fail. Because unless you are in an extraordinarily disciplined organization where you have a million different ways to resolve conflict that are formulaic and Byzantine in their adherence and complexity, like you're not going to get people to change that fast, or they're just going to lie to you. And so I think the first thing you need to do is give as many of the people who need to be involved to land a successful transformation, you need to give them the time to align and contribute to the narrative you're trying to build. And to do that, you also need to understand if there are other things changing or other equities at play that will run counter to what you're trying to accomplish, right? So a great example, let's just go back to the one we were just talking about, right? If we're trying to get the creative partners inside of a marketing organization to think about themselves as contributor to performance on a cost basis, but at the same time, they're being asked to cut costs regardless of the justifications, right? Because there's some give back organization they have to do because it is tied to a much larger macro issue in the business. If you don't give them a way to tie those narratives together, it just becomes a bit of like a game of trade-offs. And so if they see no benefit to adopting the narrative you're trying to give them, they just won't do it. And so you have to just kind of be constantly story writing. Like I do think there's a real way to think about transformation. I think transformation is a lot like just trying to do speech writing for 1,000 different people all at the same time, right? Like you need to give everybody their reason to believe, and you can't let them invent it on their own because they don't have a good reason to do so.
I think about this as many of the transformations I've seen and underwent, some of the things I personally misvalued is I spent a lot of time talking to people about the why we're going, what's the vision, et cetera. Even making sure that organizationally we had the skills and capabilities but I did not think enough about the individual motivation of each person playing a role in this, because at the end of the day, they have to see what's in it for them and believe that it's going to be greater at the end of the rainbow.
Yeah.
And I don't think, again, this is a mistake I made. I'm not sure how much it applies, but that personal motivation bit, I think we tend to forget.
Yes. And you know who I'm going to blame for this? I'm going to blame everyone's microeconomics class for this, because they think about organizations as like a bag of people, right? And that's not a good mental model for what an organization is. Right. It's not even really like a command structure. Right. I mean, how many times have you worked with companies where like, oh, the CEO's in charge? CEO's not in charge. Those decisions are being made.
I know that.
Yeah. No, but like, I mean, and sometimes the CEO is very much in charge. But what I mean is there's no such thing, I think, or I've yet to observe truly, a legitimately linear top-down structure inside of an organization. And it's not a bag of people. It's a slew of individuals with unique and differing incentives that we're trying to corral towards a task. And like it's actually beautiful in a very strange way that any of this works. It's incredible that like companies can exist, because you get 10 people in a room who can barely agree on something, and yet they can birth a SaaS solution that makes billions of dollars. And then you scale that up to suddenly you have 100,000 people coordinating their activities towards multiple end goals that all, in theory, have a greater sum than their parts. And it's just kind of wild to think that just happens. And I think, you have whole classes. I think this is like part of the thing of where we try to say, like, how does this work? Why does this work? How do you transform it? How do you meaningfully disrupt it versus being disrupted by something else? As I actually just think it's kind of wonderful. But I think that so many of the reasons why we walk into things being like, oh, I didn't think about the incentives, is that all of our training around the corporate world is never about the individuals. It's about structures, and it's about titles, and it's about reading P&Ls. And we never think like, nope, it's just a human.
I think it's about treating individuals as homos economicus.
Yeah,
the
right.
Perfectly rational man who will always follow rational interests. And my reality, at least, is that that's very far from the truth. So, okay, so you have these pockets of resistance. It sounds like what you're saying is you give people time. You accept that belief doesn't happen on a specific timeline. You are constantly trying to align the change motivations with people's personal motivations and building a story accordingly, right? And let's say I don't think you can ever perfectly squash all resistance, but let's say in your case, you got people long enough where you got to the messy middle of change. And this is where I think you get into change management as an endurance sport. Right. So let's talk about change management month 9 to 12 where some of the novelty and the initial energy of like, hey, we're doing a new thing has worn off. The perhaps momentum from the early wins is no longer enough to push you forward. So what typically happens, and what happened to you in that month, 9 to 12 of change management?
The easiest and clearest analogy is parenting, right? You're so excited. You've got this new baby. It's cute. It's doing cute baby stuff. It's cooing. You hit milestones really fast. You're like, oh, it's turned over. First smile. And then suddenly month 6 rolls in and you haven't slept, right? They're like your clothes have stains on them. You don't know how they got there. In the baby sense, you don't. And if it's in the change management, like it's just like Dorito stains from late nights working. Like it is the exact same thing as like year 1 of parenting. And how do you get through year 1 of parenting? Besides an excruciatingly large amount of coffee, which I think covers both, works really well for this metaphor.
Both situations.
You can't focus on short-term wins anymore. You have to then pivot to your eye being on the greater prize, right? After your first smile, after your first rollover, right? You're staring down, walking and talking. The game's going to get real. From a change management perspective, like you're going to have to hit a milestone. You're going to have had some kind of 12-month, 18-month, whatever milestone you've agreed on with the person who gave you the mandate to do it in the first place, right? We don't just get to have little wins. You have to build the rocks into the boulder going down the hill. And that is when the mindset does have to switch, right? By that stage, If someone's not bought in, they're not coming, right? Everyone who needs to be bought in by that point needs to be there. And if they're not, you need to have a very frank discussion with your major stakeholder, whoever's empowered you to do this work, to understand if that is a go, no-go decision for going live with whatever you're trying to change, right? If it's an org structure, if it's a process, if it's a modality of work, whatever. Basically, you have to start having the like very real discussions with yourself of, have you made the environment ready? Have you enabled everybody to successfully achieve their goals and your goal of change? And whatever you need to sort of nudge or alter structurally about the company hasn't been done. Because if it hasn't been done by that point and you keep pushing, you're going to fail. Like it's going to go off the rails and you're just going to be yet another 100-page PowerPoint buried in someone's cloud drive when someone fondly looks back on like, I remember when that thing tried to happen. Which, plug, one of the first things you should do, and I completely blanked on this, we talked about this earlier, one of the first things you should do if you're coming in to change something is do the corporate archaeology to understand why previous changes have failed. Or if they haven't failed, why did they succeed? A lot of companies live in this like eternal sunshine of the spotless mind perspective of like nothing older than 3 years matters. But if you're in a company that's 10, 20, in some cases, like previous places I've worked, over 100 years old, a lot of stuff has been done before. There's a lot of failure to learn from. But we in the corporate world talk a lot about learning from failure, but very infrequently do it. Yeah. So that is the point where I think you need to assess, like, are the conditions right for success or not? And if not, you need to be very frank about it, because you don't want to end up in a scenario where you're trying to push water up a hill and getting people to do things against their incentives because you haven't understood what they're doing. Or if you've neglected to actually get good bottoms-up information, like another huge problem. If by month 9, if you haven't like talked to the people in the trenches, you don't have a good idea of what's going on. So many of these transformation things try to start from the top, get your leaders bought in, but you're almost always getting curated information at that point. And you can't really be effective with wholly curated information. You need to get the raw, unfiltered, grievances from the folks who are in the trenches, because that's the only way you can fix the trenches, right? If I asked a general what a private's concerns are, he is just going to give me the opinions of his lieutenants, who are themselves a couple chains removed. You should probably go talk to the sergeants, because they're the folks down there listening to everyone, at the bottom level and what's going wrong. And so I think that if you haven't done that by month 9, month 10, then you're just not set up to succeed very effectively. And so that's when you really need to think, like, am I going to achieve this task, right? Is my baby going to walk? Now, the lucky part of a baby is like, yeah, the baby's probably going to walk. Like, you're going to get there eventually. But there's no guarantee of that in like a corporate world. Like, you may fail. And I think most things do. Understanding that like most transformation projects fail. Just, I'm sure that there's some McKinsey report somewhere that will back this up. We can go find it. Or maybe not, probably not a McKinsey report. I don't think they have incentive to talk about things failing. Somebody somewhere has incentive to actually look at how often these projects fail. And I would take to guess that probably more often than not they do. But that failure gets spun as some kind of like smaller success or, a change in strategy or something like that. But that 9 to 12 month period is when it's going to happen. That's when it's going to be the make or break.
So it sounds like there are a couple of things here, right? There is a self-awareness to know and identify who's bought in, who's not bought in. And at this point, recognizing if you're not bought in, you're not coming. What does that mean organizationally if we're serious about making change? The other thing that I thought you said that was very astute is, in order to get through this messy middle and build endurance, you need missionaries on the ground floor who deeply believe in the thing, because that's probably going to be the tipping point for the change to happen. It's no longer you standing at the top of the mountain shouting about how great the promised land is. There need to be people who believe it, who feel it, who act it every day.
Yeah.
Now, I want to come back to something you said at the very beginning, which is recognizing that change management is a game of emotional strength.
Yep.
And my sense is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, then the need for this emotional strength is probably highest during this endurance part
Right.
of the race. So how do you manage that? How did you manage that when you were undergoing your transformation, other than what sounds like a lot of Doritos and coffee?
Well, Doritos has not funded this podcast, so we're not going to say it was a lot of Doritos. No, you have to have a degree of mental resiliency and a deep empathy for people to do it right. Because at the end of the day, this entire conversation has been about like people have feelings and you have to like understand that or you get nothing done. That's like just sum up like transformation. Like, yeah, just maybe like care about how people feel. To do it effectively, I think you have to draw personal value from people. And maybe that is being empathetic or being a people person, or I'm sure there's like a bunch of like corporate psychology you could do here. But ultimately, if you don't somehow draw resiliency or energy or strength from engaging with people, then this is like not the job for you. Like, don't go into this kind of work. Because if it is just always going to draw your battery down to have hard conversations, then you'll be exhausted before you've even, gotten off the block. Because all of this kind of work is about getting people to want to change in a way that you really want them to. And most people don't. So the only way you can draw strength from that is you draw strength from just people in general. And if you find joy in working with people, right, as opposed to, working in a much more like sterile environment or in a much more ordered sort of corporate environment, right? That's probably especially true for the kind of work I do, right? I work in analytics spaces. Analytics professionals are not necessarily known for being the most extroverted. And so I work quite frequently with people who are usually introverted, have a wide sort of set of emotional styles, but are often a bit more muted, very much like to work with hard numbers, hard facts. And I draw personally a lot of energy and excitement from getting those individuals to care about something and to get them working on things they care about and getting them excited. And so I just get so much value from that it was never really exhausting. Like, I never get burnt out working with people. And so I think that's maybe how I view it, as how you sort of stay resilient with it. The other part is you have to believe in what you're doing, but you have to not believe that you're right. You just have to believe that the goal is right, right? If you think that your particular vision is absolutely and wholly correct from the beginning, that's kind of a weird way to start a change management process, right? You can't know what needs to change until you're in deep with all of the people you're trying to convince to change. And so if you have a rigid, inflexible view of the end point before you've actually seen the map, then like you're also not going to succeed. And so I think having a lot of interest and gaining joy or at least energy from working with people and having a flexible approach to like success and success benchmarking and thinking through that for yourself and for others. I think those are sort of the necessary preconditions to doing it well.
Yes. It sounds like there is a belief that the final destination is worthwhile and important, but being very flexible and adaptable on how you get there.
Right.
At the same time as being energized by taking people on a journey, maybe
Right.
helping them see something they didn't necessarily see before. I almost think about it as the kind of people who get energy from a debate, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to be a part of the energy.
Yeah. It's not a bully pulpit. It's like you're trying to have like a buddy pulpit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You're trying to co-opt everybody into the idea
Absolutely.
of some kind of success.
There's reward in bringing people on the journey with you. And you're right. I think that is a very personal psychological trait. Now, you talked a little bit about most of these things fail, and I want to get to kind of the final stage of change transformation, which is what I broadly think of as like the tipping point, right? At some point, you have to come to some admission as to whether or not this program is working
and we continue to barrel down this road, and I continue to barrel down this road as its leader,
Yeah.
or this transformation is not working and we got to call it. I disagree that most of these change management programs fail loudly. I think they actually die very silently and slowly, and we sort of sweep it under the rug.
Yep.
But I want to hear about your experience here specifically, because I think what makes you really unique here is that you're very open about the fact that this change management that you were brought in to drive did not end the way you wanted it to.
Right.
So what was that tipping point for you, and how did you determine for yourself that I need to walk away now?
I knew it wasn't going to work. I mean, there's a practical and a philosophical sort of moment, right, where you understand, like, hey, maybe I'm not going to succeed in this task that was before me. The practical side is when you start to see, like, all right, operationally, the things that need to change didn't change, right? Or in a trivial sense, imagine like the budget you needed to be set aside to accomplish task A doesn't materialize.
What did that look like for your program? Like, what needed to change for this creative transformation that didn't change?
Yeah. So in our case, imagine we needed to bring on partners to do certain kinds of measurement for us, right? Like we needed those partners to do it. We didn't have the capability in-house. That was part of the transformational ask, is we need to budget for these partners moving forward, because then once we have that in place, we can, get all of the rest of these production processes change, et cetera. And as we went through it, the budget just never prioritized. Now, there were, in this case, a lot of macro conditions that caused it. There were a lot of changes in commodities prices that just caused so much budget uncertainty that, for a lot of very good reasons, tons of budget asks were being just axed, right? And that's, you can't really fight that logic, right? The stewardship of the P&L is a very important part of being an executive. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose some. And when there's very large unknown variables out in the world, that's going to introduce a bunch of noise into any system. So you just can't see through that. You can't predict it very well. Philosophically, so away from the practical side of this, and maybe this is like the introspective part, is I realized that the attitudes and opinions and incentives that needed to change for this to work had not changed.
Whose responsibility is that?
The responsibility to acknowledge that hadn't changed?
No, to change some of those incentives.
Oh, that in this particular case, the organization was so highly matrixed that no one person had the appropriate mandate to actually get everybody to swim in the same direction. And so that was, I think, the thing that I had failed to see, was to get this done, I needed the creative folks, the marketing folks, the financial folks, certain parts of like central planning, all the different people who would be involved in financial and production areas all had to think the same way. And I didn't have the actual mandate to get all of them on board. I could control my side of the house, right, in just my little area. But I did not have, nor did the person who brought me in, none of us had the mandate to get everybody to go in the same direction. And so without the ability to get buy-in from the top, because in this case, the top wasn't really a part of this entire work stream, I realized that we were just not going to be able to effectively get this done. And so when that happens, then you have to start to draw everything down, because if it's not going to be successful, you can't keep pushing, right? Then that just breeds resentment, and you get all of the sort of negative knock-on effects from getting folks just constantly pushing a misaligned narrative on them.
So it sounds like when you come across a lever that you can pull, but even in this case, it sounds like that no one can really pull and no one is incentivized to pull.
Right.
No amount of energy is going to get you up that hill.
Yeah, I think a better way to think about it would be, it wasn't one lever. What needed to happen was 10 people sort of backstage all pushing the lights up at the same time.
Yeah.
But the problem was that I couldn't get all 10 people to show up to the backstage at the right time to all flip the lever at the same moment. Knowing that coordination problem was insurmountable due to sort of the structural realities of the broader enterprise, we just had to call it a day.
So when you reflect back, and now you've got the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
When you reflect on this journey, I'm curious about, what did it cost you personally?
Yeah.
But also, what did you take away from it that you think will make you more effective at doing these types of transformations in the future, if you want to?
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It cost me nothing. I learned a lot. And I think I've learned, well, maybe I've learned nothing, but I have some new theories. I do think I have one theory now that I really want to investigate and prove, which is I think that there are limiting factors to the speed of transformation. Thing that you and I discussed before. I think the speed of transformation is limited to the speed of the manufacturing process of the organization you're in. So if you are a knowledge services company where the time it takes to manufacture is the time it takes to write a document or create a PowerPoint or something like that, then you can transform pretty quickly. If you are a manufacturing company who makes actual stuff, who has factories in different places, I think transformation is limited by the speed of manufacturing, because that dictates the cadences of decision-making in an organization, right? If you're a place that makes widgets and those widgets get produced on a quarterly cadence, you might not be able to do anything faster than those pre-existing structures, because in order to do something faster, you have to change the entire cadence of the operation. And so I now have this theory about like, okay, before you come in, you need to make sure that the transformation timeline is actually married to the timeline that the company operates at. Or if the thing they want to transform is to change the speed of their company operations, they have to be much more willing for a significant amount of disruption very, very quickly, which I don't think most organizations want when they bring in a transformation officer. They don't want someone in there breaking how their company operates on a daily basis right away. But I think that's required if they're trying to actually change that timetable that they work on. I think I learned that. And I think I've learned how to have a much more people-oriented, ecosystem-oriented view as opposed to just trying to change processes, right? Like I definitely think transformation is a people task, not a process task, not a technology task. Like I truly don't think transformation is a technology question. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, oh, I'm going to hire a chief transformation officer, and it's really just like a sort of masqueraded CTO.
Yeah, or worse, we're going to bring in this tool and we've transformed.
Yeah, right. Like, oh, great, another AI tool. It is truly about people. And I think probably the best transformation officers are folks who've had a lot of people experience, which anyone at that level will. They will have managed large teams or whatever. But I think having a grounding in the psychology of how people want to make decisions and how their decision making can be altered or how their incentives can be structured, I think that's important. I think those are probably the two things I learned are like the speed at which you do things has to be fit to the company, not what the company says they want, how they actually operate, and focusing on people much earlier in the operation of changing things.
So my last question for you, the number one thing I get asked about when I meet with marketing leadership is this question around, I know things need to change, but I don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. Some version of that problem. And so if, I'm sure there are people who are listening who can think of a change that they want to drive and they don't know how to start. If on Monday there's one right next step, just one foot in front of the other, that someone can take to start this journey for them and start taking the organization to where they believe it should go, what should they do?
Enthusiastic complaint. Or let me restructure that. The best way to complain is to make stuff. And so if something isn't working, the best thing I think you could do is enthusiastically tackle the problem and document how you're tackling it and produce that documentation in like an extravagant form for someone who might care. So the biggest hurdle to transformation processes is indifference. Look, at the end of the day, like people work jobs because they need money or they need health insurance, right? Like most of us don't define ourselves by our jobs. Our jobs just allow us to live. And so you may care deeply about your job because you need it, but a lot of people don't care beyond just making sure that they're doing enough to like make sure that they like accomplish their tasks, that their manager likes them, right? They get good reviews, whatever. But if you care enough to see a problem, and if you care enough to try to fix it, and then care enough to tell people about how you tried. That is kind of the first precondition to wanting to transform things, right? That is the first step, right? A transformation process usually doesn't start because a CEO wakes up one morning and says, "Oh, something's amiss," right? Like it's not as if it's this, ex nihilo understanding of massive problems in their company, right? Maybe it comes from the board, but often what it starts at is this like low level rumble at the bottom of folks saying something's not working, and then that percolates its way upwards and it gets transformed and it gets softened because the director layer of every organization likes to soften language. That's what they do. By the time it gets there, it is a acknowledgement, heavily curated, that something is amiss. And the only way that starts is at that low level rumbling. I think. Like, I don't think transformation being driven by a board is nearly as effective as transformation being driven by the bottoms up. And so if you're at an organization, if you're a transformation leader, or if you're just like a person, right? Just a normal person, enthusiastically complaining. But where I mean a complaint is showing there's a problem and trying to solve it. And by enthusiastic, I mean like treating it as a project you want to do and approaching it like wholeheartedly, full-throated, whatever, funny phrase you want to use there. But enthusiastic complaints tend to be viewed as catalysts. And if you can turn your complaint into a catalyst, then that can turn into change. And so I think that's what I would tell people to do. Like, just find a thing that sucks.
Well, I think
try to fix it.
I think that's
right?
very actionable, right? And I think it highlights that, to your point again, transformation is not about technology. It's often not about process. It's about people.
Right.
And that journey, that first domino to fall, has to be a person.
Yeah.
Who I would only amend your enthusiastic complaining to say yes about enthusiasm, but it also has to have optimism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
See, I think of enthusiasm and optimism as being concurrent.
Sure, you go.
but I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
But no, I think that is very actionable, because I do think there are a lot of people sitting in organizations who see a better way, who want to positively impact change. They don't know how to. And some of them come out through this process emotionally drained and feeling like, I don't know if I can go on that journey again.
Right.
And so recognizing that it is meant to be exhausting and it is meant to be emotionally difficult. And that's why it's called transformation. No movement is ever easy. No change is ever easy. But there are rewards at the end, not necessarily financial rewards or operational rewards, but rewards in that you did something that changed the way an entire group of people worked.
I mean, there's a reason most marathon runners run another one, right? Like, is it exhausting when you're doing it? God, yes, right? Like, is the training abysmal some days? Sure. But the endorphins when you're done, that dopamine hit, makes you want to come back again. So,
well, I can't wait to hear about your next transformation. So hopefully
I'm going to hold you to that.
Oh, you got it. You're welcome back anytime, sir.
Oh.
Seriously, thank you. Thank you for the candor, the reflections, the actionable way in which you've broken it down. I think many people, again, sweep these things under the rug and let them die silently. So I think it is very rare to hear someone openly talk about the fact that, there was a big mission and we were not successful, and here's why.
Yeah.
And if anyone takes anything away from it who is listening, I hope it's that they are not alone. And some of this pain is actually normal.
Yeah.
So hang in there.
Yeah. Failure can be fun. That's what we want everybody to know. You can have fun in failure.